Yeah, hello everyone. We're really glad to be back for this afternoon. And we'll have Jonathan Hersh with us, who wrote some really interesting economic research articles about APIs, value, growth, public valuation, companies, profits, revenues. He will tell you all of this in this presentation for the presentation about how APIs create growth for firms. So please, an online welcome and an in-person welcome and applause for Jonathan. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mehdi. Really appreciate that. It's really wonderful to be here with a group of people who are implementing APIs as well as developers. My name is Jonathan Hersh. I teach at a university in California, Chapman University. I've spent my career both in academia as well as a developer, a data scientist. So the fun thing that I get to do as an academic is I get to spend a lot of time on one question I think is very important. And so I think APIs are very important. And I spent a lot of time working on this, and I think we have some fun things to talk about here. But I also have a startup called WorkHelix. We're hiring. It's a very fascinating startup. If you want to talk to me about that, I'm really happy to tell you about that. This paper is joint with two very smart people, Marshall Van Alstyne, who's at Boston University, and Seth Benzel, who is a colleague of mine at Chapman. So what am I going to talk about? So you can think of this as a primer of a bunch of results you want to give to your CEO that tell them how to think about APIs from a business strategy perspective. And to do that, we're going to look at firms that are publicly traded. So anything that's traded on the New York Stock Exchange, the S&P, we're going to see their examples of how they use APIs, what really drives growth for them. So a lot of this work is based on a paper. If you're curious about this paper, this link will take you to it. Happy to talk about the results. The fun thing that I get to do is talk to developers, how they're using technology, and then take a step back and say, OK, what do we think about? How does this inform what our thinking about the economy? So how would an economist think about APIs? So there's kind of two competing theories for this. The first theory is that, well, they're going to improve internal communication or programmer efficiency. Right? Once we implement, every firm or every department within a business is using APIs, those departments are going to be able to program more effectively. They're going to communicate more efficiently. And this is like the traditional pipeline process that you think about in terms of developing any kind of process. The alternative hypothesis is that it's really about getting all the smart people outside of your firm to contribute value internally within this firm. This is a variant of the invert the firm hypothesis, where it's let's take a firm and let's take all the relationships and kind of like build them outward as opposed to building them inward. And we're going to try to investigate. I think this is really how economists investigate this. And we're going to try to develop some analyses that tell us which one of these are correct. But in the process of doing this, we're also going to have to answer a couple other questions. The first thing we're going to have to answer is, like, how much value do APIs actually create for firms? Now, this is the one that your CEO is going to love to hear. But there's a real challenge here, which is that the firms that open up APIs are just different than the firms that don't. They're full of very smart people who come to conferences like this, who deserve to get paid way more. And so we have to think very carefully about the causal identification issue. And hopefully we can convince you that we've done that. Now, of course, if they do work, how do they add value? These two competing hypotheses. Is it about internal efficiency gains, or is it about bringing outsiders into the firm? And then finally, we want to talk a little bit about risks. So what risks do APIs pose, particularly for these firms that have opened up APIs? Can we say something broadly? And specifically, we're going to talk about hack risks. All right, so this is the outline for the rest of the talk. I just want to get into it. I'm going to show you kind of mapping the digital economy using APIs as connectors between firms. Then I'm going to answer all these questions for you, and then we'll have some time for some thoughts and questions. So to answer this, we're going to assemble a lot of different data sources. I'm going to start with programmable web. Programmable web is it's kind of like Wikipedia for APIs. So it's crowdsourced. People can contribute and say this is an API used for this type of use. You can actually follow and like different APIs. You can be attached to different types of APIs. It's a really useful website. We're also going to take data from firms from this data set CompuStat. So there's 80,000 publicly traded firms, and we have yearly time series, actually quarterly time series for all these firms. We have some private API data from an API provisioning company that talks about internal APIs. So we can say something about public APIs versus internal APIs. And then we're going to also take some hack data that tells about data breach from Privacy Rights Clearinghouse. OK, so I want to show you some interesting plots that kind of describe the digital economy via APIs. So we scraped all these APIs from programmable web. We had their permission, don't worry. So we have about 25,000 APIs, and we're going to measure them over time and see when they open up. And then we're going to measure kind of apps that connect these. So we also measure apps that connect one API to another, so we can see if in API land these two firms are connected to each other. And so let's see what that looks like. OK, so every dot here, that's a different firm. We've matched the APIs to that firm. Whenever there's a core that's connecting the two, that's an app that's connecting them. And this was the birth of the API network in 2005. So at the beginning, we really didn't see a lot of APIs. We had Google Maps, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, Flipper. This was really the advent of social. The first APIs were really about social. If we flip forward in time to 2006, we start to see the development of these social that are starting to mash up between each other. So Google Maps is now talking to YouTube, which is talking to Flickr, which is talking to Twitter. At this point, we start to see a little bit more development in terms of productivity. So in green, we see this e-commerce that starts to grow out. We see Amazon products advertising. We see Google Checkout. So we see development of just different types of APIs. If we fast forward even forward, now we start to see the growth of productivity. We have Dropbox. We have Box. Once we hit 2013, that's where we see Coinbase start to come up. We have this whole land of crypto. We have Shopify. And from there, things kind of stabilize. So this is pretty much the network that we have in 2007. It's somewhat stabilized, but of course, a lot more things are developing out. We can zoom in here and say, what are e-commerce? What is a network of APIs for e-commerce? What does that look like? How about search? What does that look like? Productivity. And notice that we learned something about the API given how many firms are connected to it, right? You really want to be Google Maps here. If you're Google Maps, that means that there's a lot of different apps or APIs, apps that are connecting you to other APIs. And that's going to prove to be advantageous within this whole network. So, something to think about is like, how can you encourage more apps to contribute and develop and tie together your API and become more of a central node within this environment? Other fun stuff we can do is we can say, OK, at the one-digit industry level, what are the industries that use APIs the most? And we see over time that, certainly we see growth in all API use in all industries. I think the surprising thing to me is that the penetration rate of APIs overall in the industry is just super low, right? At the one-digit industry level, it's less than 5%. So for people who say like APIs are over, the glory days are gone, like this is still very, very early. And I was surprised by this because somebody who works in technology, I'm like, what are you for your firm that doesn't have APIs, right? But there's still a lot of growth here to be done. If we zoom in a little bit more at the two-digit industry level, we can see a little bit more heterogeneity. Surprisingly, like transportation, air transportation has the highest incident of publicly facing APIs. Something like 20% of those airliners have publicly APIs. But we still have this huge mass of industries that are just like not using APIs. And if you're thinking about, I've got this product and it's really going to transform your business, you could certainly go for the ones that already have established APIs, but there's a lot of low-hanging fruit here for industries that just don't have a lot of APIs. we couldn't really find industries that had no APIs. It was just that, there's some firms that operate in the space where, in the same industry, they're competing with each other. Some firms have APIs, some don't. OK. So this is all cool stuff we can do with our data. We're going to start to investigate those questions that we have, right? We really want to know, so what is the impact? What happens when a publicly traded firm opens up an API? How much larger does their stock price grow? So we're going to do some fancy econometrics here. We're going to estimate what are called two-way fixed effects models. And so the thing we're trying to predict is the firm market value, or the firm stock price. And we're doing that over multiple time periods for multiple firms. And the things that we're going to estimate is this API. So this is a 0 or 1. It's 1 when the API is active, and it's 0 when there's no API. And we're going to measure it right around the time that it opens up the API. These other things are just controlling for firm and time characteristics, because we want to make sure that we're not comparing Apple to Google, right? They're just very different firms. There's big firms or small firms. We're kind of controlling, and there's also time effects, right? 2017 is a very different time than 2009, right? So econometrically, we're controlling for as much as we can. And really, the thing that we really want to measure here is what is this beta? So what is the coefficient impact when you open an API? And ideally, what we see is right after you open an API, the stock market rewards you or it doesn't reward you. That's really the thing we're going to try to measure here. I'm sorry if this is like a stats lecture, but this is like, I thought like we'd all appreciate that just because, yeah. Maybe you have like bad memories of statistics, maybe you have like good memories of statistics, but this is the kind of stuff that's like, the bread and butter of economics, so we're happy to do it. OK, so first regression I want to show you, we're trying to predict the firm stock price. We're controlling for the individual characteristics at the firm level, the time level. And what's really interesting is what happens right after you open up an API. And what we see is this positive and significant coefficient. And what does that actually mean? What this means is that the firms who open up APIs have a 38.7% larger market value or stock price than the firms that don't. This is like a big takeaway, right? Your stock price will grow by 40% if you open up an API. And we're controlling for as much as we can here, the differences between firms. There's really nothing that makes this go away. If we exclude the top API players, this number is still there. Curiously, if we look at the smallest firms, they actually grow faster. The effect size is even larger for smaller firms by some amount. So this is not being driven by big players in the market. And I have to say, this really surprised me. I don't think I've found an effect size this consistent and this large in my career. This is just something that you can't knock away, even though I'm trying to, right? So that's good, right? So you already have something you can tell your CEO. You can say, let's open up APIs. Our stock price is going to grow by 40%, right? That's already pretty good. But wait, you say that there's something intangible about the firms that open up APIs, right? They have super smart people, even controlling for the difference between Apple and Google. Maybe there's something that's systematically different that you can't control for. OK. So what we often do in this situation is we do something called synthetic control analysis. And the concept of this is really simple. You have the firm that opened up the API, and you have a bunch of firms that don't open up APIs. And we're going to try to find a match for that firm that opened up an API between all the firms that don't open APIs, based on all the observable characteristics that we have of the firms, right? So we're going to have a perfect treated and control group for these firms. And once we do this, the effect size doesn't go away. In fact, it somewhat gets larger, right? So, and this black line, those are the firms that open up their APIs. These are the firms that don't open up their APIs. And we see that the trend is distinct between those two. It's significant. The difference between these two lines for the average firm is $8 billion. This is just really, really good. And we're doing everything we can to control for the differences between these two firms. We have a couple more robustness checks in the paper. But I think that as a high-level kind of scientific enterprise, we're doing probably the best that can be done. Ideally, we like randomize. We say, firm 1, you can open up an API. Firm 2, you can't, right? But nobody gives us dictatorial powers, so we have to like do all these fancy econometric stuff to infer. Okay, something else we might want to say is, well, what if you just have a super popular API? Is that better? Well, it looks like it certainly is. If we look at your change in market value, your change in firm price, as like a function of the rank of the number of connections that are connecting to your firm's APIs, there's a strong relationship between those two things. So the more apps you have connecting to your API, the kind of faster your market value grows. We do some other fancy econometrics things in here to show you that like this effect doesn't go away. So it does, having a more popular API is definitely helpful. The fancy stuff that we do is we look at disconnections to APIs. So there are some APIs that are deprecated. And once that API is deprecated, it sort of changes the landscape of APIs. And we measure what happens to the number of connections when when the APIs next to you are deprecated. And we find that it like severely decreases your stock value, which is kind of surprising. Okay. So, all right. So we answered the question of like, how much do APIs increase firm value? We haven't really answered the question of like, how do they do this, right? So we have these two hypotheses. So they can improve internal communication and program error efficiency, or they can invert the firm, like allow outside users to create complementary products. I just want to do like a show of hands. Like, how many people think 1 is going to drive the result? How many people think 2 is going to drive the result? Okay, so like most people think that number 2 is driving the result. And you guys are smart. Like, you guys are working with APIs. You know the thing to say. So you guys got that correctly. Maybe it's a weak hypothesis, but it certainly is aligned with what we found in the data. It turns out if you just use internal-only APIs, there's no effect on firm market value. So you want to expose your APIs to the world, let people use them. It really is about this outside engagement with firms. So we can look at, how many people on programmable web, do they follow your API? How many developers do you have? How many people are engaged with that API in a really productive capacity, right? It's not necessarily about consumptive, it's about how much production is happening through that API. And we find is that it's really about this outside developers. It's about smart people going from the outside coming in who are doing something clever with the things that you allow them to do, this permissionless innovation that you've enabled through your APIs. What's a takeaway for you here? Just make it as seamless for them as possible in order to do this. Make sure that your documentation is up to date. Make sure that you throw conferences for people. Make sure that you have your developer kits. Like, do all the things that make it as seamless as possible for all the smart people outside your firm to provide their value internally, and then integrate that in some permissionless way. Okay. Another thing we find is that even if we control for the amount of assets that are deployed, the APIs are still important. This is not just a scale issue. APIs don't just let you scale faster. They kind of allow you to incorporate stuff outside that is really smart. So it's not just about you're deploying assets faster or quicker. It's really about that outside coming in. Okay. But what about the downsides? So if we saw at the top of this, we saw that so many firms are not using APIs. Penetration rate is still very low. Some part of that is just company culture. Some part of that is the challenge of engineering these objects. But what about the risks of this? And so really the analogy that we use is the analogy of an aperture in a camera. So the aperture in a camera allows a certain amount of light in. Too much light, the photo gets overexposed. Too little light, the photo is underexposed. and you really just want to adjust that amount of aperture so the exposure is correct. And what's the analogy here to APIs? Well, when we expose a firm's operations using an API, we're letting all these smart ideas come in. And like the problem that half of these talks are about is like, well, how do we make sure that the people who are contributing aren't nefarious actors, right? They're operating in good faith. They're not people who are trying to just do something shady, right? OK. So we're going to look at specifically those firms the 2 years after they open an API. And we look at well, do those firms experience hacks at a greater rate in the 2 years afterwards? And we can decompose the different breaches by any type, right? So this is any breach event. We really don't see any effect. How about breaches of credit card info? Really don't see much of an effect. Breach via malicious hack, not much of an effect. A little bit of effect by a stolen document or fixed computer. Where we do see a very, very large effect is on this breach via malicious insider. Now, just to read what this coefficient means, what this means is that in the 2 years after you open an API, you are 6 to 7 times more likely to be hacked by a malicious insider. 6 to 7 times. Now, the base rate of this is kind of low, right? So it's like, maybe there are 10 hacks, and this is increasing that to 60 or 70, right? That's why we're getting these really large numbers. But that's still like a very, very large number. And this is bad, right? But it's kind of curious, right? Like, how is it happening via malicious insiders? Like, what is the conduit through which that's happening? Like, what is the mechanism? So let's dive a little further. So people remember the Target hack, right? The Target hack that happened who remembers the Target hack? OK. So the Target hack happened in 2013. It was very expensive. It was millions, hundreds of millions of records were exposed. It was credit card info that was exposed. But if we dive a little deeper, we can give us a little insight into that malicious insider effect of APIs. So here's actually what happened. This is so weird. Basically what happened was that some malicious person, some hacker, got a hold of the security credentials for an HVAC company that was a contractor with Target. So they were able to get the API credentials from this HVAC, who then increased once they were inside the system, they increased their permissions and pivoted over their point of sale systems through which they were able to expose all the credit card info. And you don't read of this as like an API failure, right? In the news, you don't really hear that. You just hear this top level line, people hacked into this. But you don't really think about the mechanisms through which this happened. But we're finding effect of this at the economy level. Looking at all these firms, we're really seeing this type of malicious insider impacting in the time after you open up your APIs. OK, so this is bad. That's the bad news, right? I think when you think about why don't we open up APIs, it's because if you're the CTO and something bad happens, you get fired. Your stock price goes up, you see a little bit of that benefit, but you might get fired. And there's other good research that shows what happens to the governance of a firm after you get hacked. And it's just bad. It's a bad look, right? Nobody wants to be responsible or stay up at night, right? Worrying about these kind of things. OK, so that's the bad news. I think for the good news, I want to show you some evidence that we have. So we can look from this API provider, we can look internally about communication flows within the firm between different API categories. So we actually have the amount of calls and the amount of data that's transferred within a firm on these different. And this is a couple hundred firms that are represented here. And we can look at total API data, and we're doing this right before and right after a hack. So we're seeing what happens internally in the API network before and after a hack. And we see a decrease in total API data. That's kind of transitory. It goes back up. We see this uncategorized data go down. But we see this testing API data go up, login authorization go up. And so this is the thing I really want to highlight. Once a firm is hacked, they kind of realized that, like, well, we've been operating our APIs in a really systematically dangerous fashion. We probably need to do a lot more of testing, a lot more login authorization. We probably don't want to have so many uncategorized APIs. Yeah, and so, this is a hopeful story, which is that Target got hacked. They exposed a bunch of their records. It's certainly bad. You don't want to do that, but the overall lesson is that firms kind of learn from this example. And they pick up a lot of money by increasing their stock price, and they learn a lot. And this is also a time period in which we were still learning about APIs. We didn't know exactly the right protocol for securing them. So we've learned a lot of lessons here. But even in the early infancy, we learned how to utilize them better. And so that's another really hopeful lesson that we can take away from here. Of course, there's always this cat and mouse game between the malicious people and the people who are operating these. And so we're always going to see some form of this, I think. There's always going to be some risk. The point is that you want to be on the upward slope after this happens, right? Ideally, you do things before, but there's going to be new types of hacks. There's going to be new types of attacks, different vectors of attack, different penetration points. But we're leaving a lot of money on the table if we don't open up our APIs. Okay, all right. So what we've done in this work is we've shown really large effects of opening APIs. Firms that open public APIs, they have about 40% higher stock price than firms that don't, and that's great. Investors love that. Everyone in the firm loves that. People who have options love that. And I think we've done this to the best we can in terms of econometric identification. And then we really see that the firms that have are better positioned within this API network, that have more connections, that facilitate more apps that are connecting between different firms, those firms grow even faster. We don't really find much effect of it. How is this happening? We don't find much effect of this internal productivity. Most of the benefits are really just about all the smart people outside your firm that you're letting them play around in your world and doing fun stuff that adds value to your firm. There is a risk here about hacks. There is a risk here about malicious insiders. But knowing that that's the mechanism through which that happens, we can secure APIs and we can get the benefits without a lot of the costs. Okay, so really happy to present that work. If you have thoughts about this, I'd love to hear them. We're doing follow-up work about specifically startups. So we're looking at the role of how startups are utilizing APIs. So if you have thoughts on that, I would love to come and talk. You can access me either by my email. I'm also on Twitter. My handle is dogmaticprior. So I'm really happy to talk with you about this. I'd love to just hear your thoughts. I'm not one of these economists who wants to stay away from the people that I want to learn from. I want to learn from you guys and kind of test this in a rigorous fashion. Thanks again for letting me be a part of this, and Mehdi, I really appreciate it. Happy to take any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you very much. We have time for one question there, one question here already. Preempted the question.
Yeah, so the internal APIs you're saying have little to no value. I could see two reasons for that. One is they just don't add value, or the second is that those who have external APIs are just overall more mature in how they approach APIs, and they're actually getting value from their internal and external APIs because they're doing internal better. Do you have any insights or theories or guesses on that dichotomy?
Yeah. When I say value, I mean the market is increasing your stock price, right? There might be internal productivity measures that we can measure from internal APIs. We just don't find that the stock market is saying it's great that you're doing internal APIs and we're going to reward you with a higher stock price. Now, we could be wrong about that, right? It also could be an issue that, well, that's not public information, right? The firm hasn't revealed that they're doing this. So how could people who are trading your stock really know about that, right? I do think that there is a bit of this, maybe it's a complement, right? So maybe you're doing internal plus external. And really when I say we don't find an effect for that, there's probably a small positive effect. right? You know, certainly reducing information frictions in a firm is a good thing. You know, we're just not seeing these really large effects that we are with public APIs, right? But I think it's a really good point, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jonathan.